Sony shut down Bluepoint.
So we got Jason Schreier to come in and talk about it.
Let's
talk about it with Jason Schreier.
Jason, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I guess starting point is the whole Bluepoint thing. When did you start getting wind of it? How long has it been something that you have been aware of? And what was the process for you to, without revealing sources and getting yourself in trouble, obviously? But
I got wind of it when they announced it to the studio and to the company. I had absolutely zero clue that this was coming until I got a message from someone being like, hey, Herman just announced to everybody that Bluepoint is shutting down. And so this was across PlayStation Studios. Just an email was sent out to everybody. And then that was about half hour before I broke the news because I had to write up a story and call Sony for comment, etc.
The fact that you never heard about it, I don't think anyone on our side heard about it. Do you think it's fair to say that speaks to how unlikely a closure that was, or do you think it's just a case of they were very good at keeping it secret?
I don't know. I mean, I get the feeling this was decided relatively recently. It's not like I often get inklings that a studio is going to shut down. It's more rare that I do. Monolith might be an exception in that I knew for a while that Wonder Woman was going to get canceled and that Monolith might be in trouble. But outside of that, I usually when I hear about a studio shutdown, it's because it was just announced. Like that's not the sort of thing that at least gets to me super early.
Had you had rumblings about projects that Bluepoint might have potentially been attached to? Because obviously there was the live service God of War and then nothing.
Yes, I had heard some of that over the last year or so. They're acquired in 2021. I believe around that time they were already working with Sony Santa Monica on God of War Ragnarok, so they keep working on that until that ships. They all move off of Ragnarok and they start working on this new service game. It's about Atreus. I think the idea was that like each player would play as like a different aspect of Atreus or something kind of amorphous like that. It was all pretty fuzzy because it never really left pre-production. But the challenge there was that Bluepoint is a studio that for the last 15, 20 years has just been making remakes and remasters. They made an original game back in 2006, but since then they've just been making remakes and remasters. So they weren't set up for designing original games. And you take that challenge and then you add the live service kind of enchilada into that, which is, it's hard enough to make a game. It's hard enough for an experienced game studio to make a live service game, a game that like can engage players for weeks and months after it launches, let alone for a studio that hasn't really made original games in the recent past before. So that was always going to be an impossible situation for them. But Bluepoint, I mean, they've said publicly, Marco Thresh, the former head of the studio, has said publicly, hey, we want to make original games. We don't want to just be a remake studio. And that was part of their whole announcement when they were acquired in 2021. About 2-3 years into development of this God of War live service game, it becomes clear that it's not coming together, and that's canceled in January of 2025. And Sony says, hey, we're going to let you guys, we're going to work together to try to figure out what's next for Bluepoint. And that is when they start going through all sorts of pitches, including the Bloodborne pitch. They pitch a Shadow of the Colossus PS5 version, potentially PC version, and they pitch a Ghost of Tsushima spin-off. And I'm sure they pitched other things as well. Those are the things that I've confirmed with multiple sources. I've heard other things just kind of here and there. I think for remasters, I've seen a lot of people on like Resetera and Reddit being like, hey, Sony has this franchise, this franchise, this franchise. Why couldn't they do a remaster of this, and this? I think remasters are not as lucrative as maybe people think they are, especially when you have a team in the United States, which is talking about expensive salaries. I don't know that they can make the financial case work for any of those.
A big part of Sony's strategy seems to be, and I'd love to get your kind of updated understanding on it, live service being a core part of the business model.
Yeah, man. I mean, it'll be really interesting to see what happens with Horizon Hunters Gathering, because like that's a studio, you look at them and they found so much success with these first two single player Horizon games, and for their next big thing to be an online game with kind of a Fortnite like art style, that's certainly a big shift for them. Yeah, I mean, we've seen some of those projects get canceled. I think Concord, when that debacle happened, I think that had an impact on the entire PlayStation organization direction and led to a lot of changes in how they do things and how they approach their money. The broader context here, by the way, that like I think you have to pretty much address with this stuff is that some of these single player projects are taking 6-7 years and $300+ million budgets, right? So they're so risky. Like the chances of making money when you're spending that much money on these projects get slimmer and slimmer. And so moving into live service for a lot of these companies is a way to mitigate that risk and be like, hey, like this has a better shot of quadrupling our profits than one of these $300 million games, as opposed to we could put $100 million into a live service game or $50 million into a bunch of live service games, and hopefully one of them makes $1 billion.
Who's telling the truth about Bluepoint? Because there was your reporting, and then Lance McDonald was like, no, I heard this. I heard it was, who killed the chances of Bloodborne?
Bluepoint put together a pitch for a Bloodborne remake or remaster, whatever it would look like. I'm not actually sure what the exact specifications were. I imagine it would look like the Demon Souls remake. But Bluepoint put together that pitch, probably made several pitches. They'd pitched this before. I'd heard about this in the past, like even pre-Sony acquisition days, and just never came together for various reasons. So they pitched it. I think Sony was on board, and Sony owns the IP, so ultimately it's up to them, but they wanted to run it by From Software, and From Software said no. I have not reported, because I do not know the answer to this question, why From Software said no. We've seen a lot of rumors surrounding, kind of theorizing, speculating about how From Software felt about the Demon Soul remake. I personally think it's a lot more complicated than that. I don't think this is just about personal tastes or distastes. I think the financial case for a Bloodborne remake was very strong, and I think Sony was interested in it, but they ultimately did not want to like torch their relationship with Miyazaki and From Software, and nobody wants to be in the business of like coming out with something that is against the original creator's wishes, I guess, except for Konami. But other than that, nobody wants to do that sort of thing. I don't really want to speculate about like the reasons From Software had for saying no, because again, I think it's pretty complicated. I think there are a lot of factors involved here, but something I've thought a lot about is IP ownership and the importance of that, especially in my personal and professional life. And I think to a company like From Software, I think when they're trying to figure out what they want to work on and their priorities, I think an IP like Elden Ring that they own, as opposed to something like Bloodborne that they do not own, it makes sense to me that they wouldn't want to put resources into a Bloodborne remaster or remake rather than working on the things that they own. And having worked at a company for a long time where I built some things that I was then dismayed to find I didn't have control over once I left that company, and then have since built our podcast Triple Click, which I own with my co-hosts Kirk and Maddie, night and day. And it's like such a different feeling as someone who's creating things, obviously different levels of creation here, different scales of creation here, but still when you're making things, doing it for something you own just feels so much better. Again, don't want to speculate here, but to me, it would make perfect sense that a company like From Software that is so creative and so auteur driven, that they would want to be like, hey, we don't want to spend all this time on a Bloodborne remaster or remake and do it ourselves or anything like that, because we don't own it. We want to work on stuff we own. That makes a lot of sense to me.
Obviously, I will speculate. And for the longest time, I've thought the best chance or the biggest indicator of whether we get another Bloodborne thing or remake is if there's any rumblings about Sony selling the IP back to From Software. I feel like if you see that happen, then it is 100% going to happen. I think Duskbloods is going to be a big part of what potentially defines how Sony approaches that in the future, because if they do that and it sells really well on Nintendo's console, I bet you they look at that and they go like, how can we get another one of those for ourselves? And in that bargaining chip, I would be very surprised if the From Software side doesn't go, give us Bloodborne and we'll give you an exclusive. So I think that's the most likely scenario, but I also feel like it's more likely that they start a Bloodborne remake and then realize actually we can turn this into a better second game and we get a Bloodborne 2 more than a Bloodborne 1. So if I was like speculating, that's the pathway I would imagine they went down, but that's just my many nights of staring at the ceiling, fantasizing. I would love to go to God of War.
Yeah.
What have you heard, or what is your kind of understanding of the current state of God of War? The remake's happening, we have this potential new game from Corey, and then there's the oddity of Sons of Sparta. I would love to know what Sons of Sparta was all about, because it just seems like a very weird misfire from them, and they're usually so good about protecting the IP and doing right by it.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that one. I guess I was kind of hopeful that that would be better than it was. I haven't actually played it, so I guess I'm just going based on the critical reception. Have you guys played it? It's really not great.
It doesn't feel like a God of War game that has the momentum of the last few God of War games. It feels like a very haphazard, slapped together God of War experience, which, again, I'm not saying that's what it was. I'm just saying, like, it doesn't feel like it had the prestige that a God of War game should have now.
Yeah, that's too bad. Well, so I wrote in my story last Friday about Bluepoint, I wrote that Sony was kind of treating the God of War universe as their own kind of mini MCU, so to speak, with series and spin-offs and sequels. And obviously we're seeing a God of War TV show. For a long time, I haven't really wanted to spoil the surprise of what Cory Barlog's next game is, and I haven't said anything on the internet other than it just not being a new IP. At some point, I think I said that last year, because a lot of people were asking me like, hey, are we going to see Sony Santa Monica's new IP? And I was just like, why does everybody think it's a new IP? I think that there was a LinkedIn profile last week that revealed, maybe inadvertently, that they were building a new kind of franchise within the God of War universe. And I'll leave it at that. I'm not going to comment on like the rumors of the specific protagonists. I want to let it be for them to kind of reveal that themselves. What I've heard sounds pretty cool, though. All that said, I think that if I were a company like PlayStation and I was looking at these games that, again, like I mentioned before, are now in the deep 9 figures to develop, 200, 300, 400 million dollars to make some of these games, especially games made by teams of hundreds of people in cities like Los Angeles, which Sony Santa Monica is based in. You're looking at these budgets and you're like, again, how do I mitigate the risk? If I was spending $10 million or $20 million on a game and I only needed to sell, I don't know, $1 million or $2 million to make a profit, then maybe I could spend a lot more time on new stuff and just take all sorts of risks with gameplay and ideas and creative opportunities there. But when I'm spending that kind of money, the $200+ million on a game, I need to mitigate risk as much as possible. And I think making games within the same franchise, but just kind of trying new things in those franchise, is a way of mitigating risk.
And when you're talking about mitigating risk, I think this is my segue into the PlayStation backing away from PC ports. PlayStation is kind of going all in on console, and like they had that brief flirtation with releasing things on PC, and now they're backing away from it.
I always find that everyone's going platform agnostic thing really fascinating, because like no one ever factors in Nintendo into it, because Nintendo is never going anywhere. They're just like, no, we're going to create this walled garden and you will play in here, or we don't care. And it seems to be working for them. So I don't know how they pull it off. I mean, we know how they pull it off to a degree, but the fact that others don't look at that and be like, oh, we should go back to that as well, is really interesting to me.
That's how Nintendo sells consoles. That's how PlayStation used to sell consoles. That's how PlayStation still sells consoles. That's how Xbox used to sell consoles. Xbox stopped selling consoles and now is doing like a distant third place in the console race because they stopped making exclusives for their consoles. Like, full stop. That is the thing you need to get people to buy your consoles. And you can kind of draw a straight line to the current like dismal state of Xbox from when they started releasing games on PC in addition to Xbox. But the thing you have to consider also that I think gets under discussed in the games industry is that when Sony sells a game digitally on PlayStation 5 through the PlayStation Store, they take 100% of the proceeds of the revenue that comes out of that title. It all goes to them because they don't have to pay a store fee because they are the store. Maybe internally, like when they play around with the budgets, maybe the studios have to pay the 30% of the store. I'm not 100% sure, but the company overall gets 100% of the money. When PlayStation sells a game on Steam, they only take 70% of that money because they have to pay 30% to Steam. That's a huge difference. And I think that plays a role in the economics here. And the other thing is, I mean, I think PlayStation, they're looking over at Xbox and saying, man, like we need to make sure that we don't lose our brand. And I think that's part of it too.
Christopher Sonderberg, the former Avalanche founder, who said, basically the headline was, we're not here to create funky business models. We're here to create great games. And story being, he had enough of the spreadsheeting of his studio and left, and now is making something else smaller. I guess the question is like, is the industry screwed, or what kind of state are we in for game development, and what is the viability of that kind of strategy going forward?
I think the US AAA industry is screwed unless it can find a way to make games in 3 years instead of 6 years, and make games for sub $100 million instead of $400 million. That to me seems like the kind of the obviously there are exceptions, GTA 6 being the biggest one, but like if you're going to paint with a broad brush, that's the state of things, I would say, especially with all of the big projects that we're seeing out of China and Korea, and we're seeing there was once a day where like you could only get the top tier games from Western developers or Japanese developers. There was once a time, believe it or not, where like even European, there was this idea of like Eurojank with games, and then CD Projekt Red comes along and changes that, and then Baldur's Gate 3 takes it to another level. So there was once a day when that was the case, when it was really US and Japan centric industry, and the rise of Asia and games like Black Myth Wukong, and there's a game coming out soon called Crimson Desert. I'm very curious to see how that does. There's a lot of hype around that game. Even companies like Virtuos making remakes of Oblivion and Metal Gear and doing it for much cheaper than you would get making it in the US. I mean, we're seeing a lot of shifts there that I think the US AAA industry needs to find a way to deal with. This era of like taking 6 to 7 years to make a new game in each franchise just can't continue for a lot of reasons. I saw a great, what was it, a story, a headline, something. I saw people pointing out that like, hey, like you're losing kids because they are growing up in between these franchises. Like it's taking so long between new entries in a franchise that kids are just have no idea that they even exist. So they're just playing other stuff. And that's such a contrast from like when the three of us were growing up, when there was like a new Final Fantasy game every year, a new whatever every 2 years, new Assassin's Creed every year. And I mean, annualizing franchise has plenty of issues of its own, don't get me wrong, but I think that these huge gaps are just gonna really be harmful to the games industry for a lot of different reasons.
What do you think the best case scenario is there? Is it a case of like the design and refinement is done in America, and then the kind of like the heavy lifting is done elsewhere?
Co-dev and like outsourcing has been a thing for a long time, but I think it's becoming more and more prevalent. Companies in the US are trying to shed more and more jobs and outsource as much as possible, co-dev as much as possible. So yeah, absolutely. I think we're seeing it quite a lot. But the question is like, how much longer do you really even need that kind of core design structure in the US as opposed to in those other countries as well? That's one big question. Yeah, I don't know, man. It's really, what are you guys hearing? What do you guys think of all this mess that we're in? You guys were both at DICE. What were the vibes you guys got?
Rancid.
Yeah, it was
despair.
It was not great.
No one
That's
has
right.
money.
Funnily enough, it wasn't as bad as the years before it. I think there was whenever we talk to people about it, there was an era of desperation like 2 years ago where it was like, if I don't leave this conference with something meaningful, it is over for me or my team or my studio or that kind of stuff. It didn't feel as prevalent at the previous DICE. It felt like people felt they have more avenues of survival, but it's still, like Lucy said, pretty rancid. And I think that the idea of like outsourcing development is becoming a bigger and bigger reality for a lot of people, and it's just a case of like, how do you square that circle with your current presence? How do you scale to meet that necessity or that reality? And obviously a lot of people are going to lose jobs, and I think there's a kind of like moral crisis happening with a lot of people who are in leadership positions right now, which is difficult. I don't know how you deal with that, but
It's also like, not to 5-stage grief it, but it felt like a lot of people were kind of in acceptance and in that we have to find a new solution sort of vibe, rather than relying on the typical AAA structure. Well, AAA will save us all. That used to be, the goal. It would be like, hey, get in AAA. AAA is more secure, whatever. No. People are now feeling like they're moving away from it.
Yeah,
by necessity, but also with the freedom that comes with it.
Yeah, I think there will be a natural process that comes out of this where people figure out a way to survive. And people always talk about, oh yeah, the AA space is going to come back. I think that something close to that could come back, or it might just be like smaller indie games raise in profile, and the people who are making them have a better understanding that they don't need to grow to a Sony level to have success. They can continue to, I think of it as the Supergiant model. Supergiant, more than any studio, has the ability probably and the case to be made for scaling up, but they just choose not to in a lot of ways, and it's smarter. They continuously put out good games, and they stay largely the same size, and as far as I can tell, that studio is doing great. Everyone in there is loving it. I see members of that studio walking around because they are San Francisco based. Everyone seems to be having a great time, and so it's like, okay, that's the kind of like model I hope that people start kind of not discovering, because everyone knows it's there, but like leaning towards as they are like trying to rebuild.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that's scary though about that for people who work in the industry is that means if everybody took that model, that would mean a lot fewer jobs for a lot of people in the US who are already struggling to find jobs. And so I think I'm afraid that we've reached this point where, because so many companies were overhiring for so long, and now have been eviscerating those jobs over the last couple of years, I don't know how many of those jobs are coming back. Like, I think there might be, in this giant game of musical chairs, I think there might be a lot of people just left out without seats, which is really tragic. Not to end on such
I was going to say a cheery note to
we
end on.
No, let's end on something better. I'm playing Resident Evil Requiem. It's pretty cool. A lot of cool indie games on my radar. I just played this game called Esoteric Ebb, which is a weird title, but really cool game. A lot of cool stuff out there. So,
did you find anything in Next Fest that you enjoyed?
I haven't, man. I was just texting with Steven Chatilla about that because he was like, I've been playing all these Next Fest games. I have so many finished games to play. I don't have the time to be like checking out demos. Like, I'll keep games on my radar, and when they're finished, I'll play them. But I just don't have the bandwidth for a lot of demos.
You should keep an eye out for Croak and Rune Dice. I think those two games are going to be pretty special. Croak especially is like a platformer where you're a frog, and the whole mechanic is almost like a kind of like grappling hook mechanic, but the frog is very squishy and bouncy, so it's like bouncing off walls and that kind of stuff. It's a very Super Meat Boy meets Mario kind of approach there, which I really like.
Thank you so much, Jason. Where can people find you? What are you up to?
Yeah, check out my show Triple Click if you want all of the accidental rumors / scoops. You can check them out there. And of course, you can find me on Bloomberg, where I write a weekly video game column and other stories here and there.